All right, so we're going to switch gears here to the question of how to feed a hungry muscle. Muscles, like every other part of the body, ultimately are powered by ATP. You remember ATP is made by metabolizing fuel in our cells. We'll get back to that in just a second. But first, let's talk about where all this ATP gets used. The biggest thing that requires ATP in a cell is the cross bridge cycle. If you recall, right here where we're breaking the cross bridge and then re-energizing the myosin head, recocking or spring loading the myosin head, we use ATP in that step. And so every time your muscle contracts, every single loop through the cross bridge cycle uses another ATP, and multiply that by however many thin filaments and thick filaments you have interacting down the length of your muscle. That's a lot of ATP that you're using for every little millisecond of contraction. In order to get to a cross bridge cycle, though, we have to have that thing called a muscle action potential. And I don't have a picture of that on this page, but the action potential is an electrical, it's electrical energy traveling down the muscle cell. And so that electrical energy has to have a power source. And again, that power source is going to be ATP. And then finally, the calcium pumps in the sarcoplasmic reticulum that suck calcium back up into the SR after the muscle contraction is done, and that keep the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum between contractions, those also use ATP. But that ATP is more used when the muscle is not contracting than at the time when the muscle is contracting. So how do we get all that ATP? Where does it come from? If you've ever asked yourself, Mommy, where does ATP come from? Here's the answer. First off, there is a certain amount of ATP stored in the cell. Okay? And that ATP, whenever the muscle is not contracting, it's still at a very slow rate making ATP. And that ATP, enough ATP can be stored in the cell to power a second or two, maybe three, of muscle contraction. But most of the time we want a longer muscle contraction than a couple or few seconds, so we need more, another source of ATP. Well, there's another energy battery in the cell. If ATP is the main battery, there's a backup battery that is only found in muscle cells, and that backup battery is creatine phosphate. You may have heard of bodybuilders using creatine supplements to try to bulk up their muscles for weightlifting. The reason that works for weightlifting is that creatine phosphate, what it does is it gets stored, creatine goes to your muscle cells, and then creatine plus ATP combine to make something called creatine phosphate. And then when you're doing a sudden, short but strong muscle contraction, like lifting a weight, creatine phosphate breaks back down to creatine and phosphate, which becomes part of an ATP, and that ATP powers up the general ATP store of your cell, which goes to power a contraction. So creatine phosphate, I've seen different numbers for this, but the general idea is you get about 10 seconds of strong muscle contraction out of your creatine phosphate storage. So again, if you're doing something like lifting a weight where it's up and then down in 10 seconds, that's maybe good enough. Or if you're on the basketball court and you need just enough energy to make a good jump shot, again, 10 seconds might be enough. But most of the time, getting our bodies down the court to the basketball hoop, for example, we need more than 10 seconds of energy. And so at that point, we've when 10 seconds is reached, we've used all the batteries in our cell. We've used the ATP battery and the creatine phosphate backup battery. So we need to start pulling fuel into our cell and burning that fuel to make energy. So while the muscle is resting, it takes some of this glucose and packs it away as a molecule called glycogen that can be stored more efficiently than glucose. And as soon as you start a contraction, it starts unpacking that glycogen to make glucose again. But it's also going to pull glucose in from the blood. And so that's your major power source for muscle contraction right there. Now, there are two things we can do with glucose. One is we can do glycolysis to make pyruvate, to make lactate, and if we have a good, well-conditioned muscle cell, then for short-term activity, that lactate will get pushed out into the blood, and it won't hurt the cell. When we do that, we make 2 ATP. That process, doing glycolysis and making lactate, is called anaerobic respiration. It uses the process of glycolysis in the cytoplasm. It does not use oxygen. No oxygen is needed. It's very fast. It's a very fast way to make ATP, but it's not sustainable because for every glucose you burn, you get only 2 ATP. That's like running along in a car at 2 miles per gallon. You might be able to get a really fast start out of that car, but you're going to burn through your gas tank pretty quickly. Also, the byproduct lactic acid, it's sometimes called lactate and it's sometimes called lactic acid. Lactic acid can build up in your muscle cells if you make it too quickly, and that can cause muscle burn, it's sometimes called a lactic acid burn. So what if we need to use our muscle for a sustainable period of time? What if we need to not just run down the court and do a jump shot, but we need to actually walk all the way across campus or down the street to the grocery store, or we're trying to go for a jog around the neighborhood or something like that? We need a longer, more sustainable way of using fuel. And that is what we call aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, you usually start with glucose, going to glycolysis, going to pyruvate, but this time you take pyruvate into the mitochondrion. And in the mitochondrion, you do something called oxidative phosphorylation, which produces something like 36 to 38 ATP. Okay, so now we can push a huge amount of ATP into that ATP storage in the middle of the cell, and that can power lots and lots of muscle contraction. The byproduct of oxidative phosphorylation is CO2, which goes to our blood as carbonic acid and then converts back to CO2 in our lungs, and we can just breathe it out, which our bodies are generally very good at doing. So that's not nearly as bad a byproduct to deal with as the lactic acid. One last note on aerobic respiration. Glycolysis, anaerobic respiration, can only use glucose as a fuel source. But once you get into long-term aerobic respiration, you can start breaking down the fat stores that your body has to make fatty acids, and you can pump those fatty acids into, or pull those fatty acids into your mitochondrion as well, and the mitochondrion knows what to do with fatty acids, so it can use those to make ATP and fuel your muscles as well. So that's why if you're trying to lose weight, trying to lose fat from your body, aerobic exercise is really the only way to go. There's a certain fat burning regime where you're using your muscles at a slow, steady rate where they're going to use fatty acids as a fuel source and not burn through all of your glycogen stores and then quit. Speaking of burning through all of your glycogen stores and quitting, there are two things I want to talk about here that are problems that occur with using your muscles faster or harder than perhaps they are conditioned to work. And the first area I want to talk about are sources of fatigue. Okay, muscle fatigue is not just tiredness. Fatigue is when a muscle is really no longer able to contract. That's when people who do exercise in sports often talk about hitting the wall. Hitting a place where your muscles just refuse to work anymore, as happened to this guy in the picture here, where he was running a race and at some point his muscles just gave out on him and he wasn't able to finish. So one of the primary sources of muscle fatigue is if you have a depletion of ATP and a buildup of ADP. That can interfere with cross bridge cycling. Obviously, the cross bridges can't cycle without ATP, and having too much ADP around makes it hard for the ATP to come in and bind and break up the cross bridges. Another cause of fatigue is buildup of lactic acid or lactate inside the muscle. If you're using a muscle faster than it is conditioned to get rid of lactic acid, then lactic acid builds up in the cell, and that causes a feeling of a burning sensation in your muscle. Also, we'll learn more about this in the nervous system chapter, but an action potential involves moving potassium from the inside of your cell to the outside of your cell. And if too much potassium builds up outside your cell, then that slows down those action potentials and you're not able to cause your muscle to contract anymore. And finally, there's the idea of depletion of either glycogen reserves, free glucose, or oxygen reserves that would make your muscle sort of hit the wall. If you're trying to contract aerobically and you don't have enough if you're trying to contract aerobically and you don't have enough oxygen, or if you're trying to contract either way and you don't have enough glucose, then your muscle is just going to refuse to work because it can't make enough ATP, and this leads to that. It leads to depletion of the ATP, buildup of the ADP, and the cross bridges don't work. Another kind of fatigue that's less obvious is what's called synaptic fatigue. As we mentioned, in order to get a muscle to contract for a long, strong contraction, we have to repeatedly stimulate the muscle. Well, what if your motor neuron is stimulating faster than it knows how? Then it can run out of acetylcholine. And if the motor neuron runs out of acetylcholine, then it just can't stimulate the muscle anymore, and the muscle will refuse to contract. And finally, there's central nervous system fatigue of two kinds. One is that the brain neurons themselves can simply run out of energy because they're continuously stimulating the same set of muscles, brain or spinal cord neurons. The other is what we call psychological fatigue, and that's where your body is simply getting so many signals from your nerves and muscles that you've been feeling like you're overusing the muscles, that you just You get a psychological feeling of wearing out, that you can't make yourself keep going anymore. Okay. The other possibility for dealing with for problems that can occur with muscle contraction is oxygen debt. This is different than fatigue, because in a case of oxygen debt, you're able to keep using your muscles. You just have to keep using them anaerobically. So in a situation where the intensity of exercise is more than oxygen supply allows, okay, let's say you have enough oxygen coming into your body to power that much exercise, but you've demanded from your muscles that they do this much exercise. The muscle, to get that extra energy, the muscle has to contract anaerobically. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you end up using this much energy more than what you've provided oxygen to your body to use. So how do we get that extra energy? We break down creatine phosphate. We break down glycogen. And we build up lactate. So in order to provide all of the oxygen that you should have had here, what we have to do is, so what we've got is basically you've used more oxygen than you actually had, so you're in debt, okay? You're in oxygen debt. And what does that debt look like? Well, during the recovery period after exercise, you've got to reproduce ATP in your muscle to restore creatine phosphate. That's going to take oxygen. You're going to have to break down lactate that's been stored in the liver, first to pyruvate and then to rebuild your glucose, and that from glucose to rebuild your glycogen stores. That's going to take oxygen. So all of these recovery steps take oxygen. So because we used this much energy, because we used this much energy that we didn't have oxygen for, we're going to have to provide that amount of oxygen after the fact, after the exercise. We have to pay back our oxygen debt. And so this is why you can do, in this case, it looks like about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 5 minutes, 4 minutes of exercise. And then you end up with 10 minutes of breathing hard to try to repay all of the to repay all of the oxygen debt that you have accumulated there. So if you've ever wondered why it is that you can sometimes be breathing hard for longer than you actually exercised, this explains that. Okay, and then the last part of this presentation, I want to talk about the types of skeletal muscle fibers in terms of their metabolism. Not all skeletal muscle fibers are the same. Even within a particular muscle, we sometimes think, well, I've got a slow twitch muscle or a fast twitch muscle. No, it's that each muscle has some slow fibers and some fast fibers, and they also break down differently by metabolism. Okay, so if your muscle fiber is geared for aerobic metabolism, we call that oxidative, and we give it the symbol O. If your muscle is anaerobically, if your muscle fiber is geared for anaerobic metabolism, then we call it glycolytic because it does glycolysis. So we give it a symbol G. You may have heard of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. There are two contraction speeds. We can contract fast, which gets the letter F, or we can contract slow, which gets the letter S. So the reason I have this little 2x2 grid over here is that there are potentially 4 ways to combine these. You could have a fast oxidative, a fast glycolytic, a slow oxidative, and a slow glycolytic. Okay, so 3 of these actually work. Okay, fast glycolytic makes sense because glycolysis happens fast. Fast oxidative makes sense. It's not quite as fast as a fast glycolytic, but you can still contract fast and use oxygen. Slow oxidative makes sense because if you're going to be slow, you might as well take the time to pump a lot of oxygen in there. What doesn't make sense is slow glycolytic. There are no slow glycolytic fibers in your body because as long as you're going slowly, there's no point in wasting the fuel that and generating the lactic acid and all of that a glycolytic fiber produces. You can tell which muscle fibers are oxidative because oxidative fibers have a red protein called myoglobin. You may have heard of hemoglobin. That's a molecule in your blood that carries oxygen around your blood. Myoglobin is a related molecule that is in your muscle, and it stores oxygen in between muscle contractions. And it is myoglobin that gives muscle a red color, and it looks very dark in the following microscope images that we'll be looking at. So if you look at this microscope image, you can see there are some very dark fibers, some very light fibers, and some halfway in between fibers. And those are going to be the 3 types of fiber. So the type 1, very dark, so it's got a lot of myoglobin, and very thin compared to the other ones, so it's going to contract fairly slowly. It's relatively thin, so it's not very strong, but it's very, very good. It's got all that myoglobin. It's very good for prolonged contractions. So this is sometimes nicknamed the marathon runner's muscle because it can keep contracting over and over again at a relatively slow rate for a very long time. How about then a fast oxidative fiber? This fiber is a little bit bigger than the slow oxidative. It's more pink instead of red or brown, so it's a bit less myoglobin than your SO or type 1 fiber, and it's got more speed and more power than an SO, but not quite as much speed and power as the next type that we're going to look at. Because it's got all that myoglobin and because it's oxidative, it's fatigue resistant to some degree, but you can still wear these out. So this is more your mile runner's muscle. This is the person who can maybe run a 5K, but the 10K starts to wear them out. Or not the person, but the muscle fiber that can run a 5K, but the 10K starts to wear it out. Then finally, the fast glycolytic fibers here, these are anaerobic, so they're completely white because they don't have any myoglobin. They're very thick, so they have a lot of power, and they contract very rapidly. So these are the fastest muscles you have. They're the ones they're sometimes nicknamed the sprinter's muscle because they can get you from 0 to 60 very quickly. Sometimes also called the weightlifter's muscle because most of the time when you're doing bodybuilding weightlifting, you're doing a quick contraction and then letting go, as opposed to holding something for a really long time or doing a long aerobic workout or something. These muscles do fatigue very quickly, however, because they don't tend to use oxygen. They tend to use glycolysis, and so the lactate builds up and the glycolysis goes down and the glycogen goes down, and so they run out of steam pretty quickly. And then this is just a summary of those three types of fibers. Again, you have your slow oxidative fibers that are slow, but they have very good resistance to fatigue. You have your fast oxidative that are somewhat fast. They're not going to power a sprint, but they're somewhat fast. They're good for, running a half mile or a mile or so. They're an intermediate resistance to fatigue. And note also that because these two use oxygen, they also both have a lot of mitochondria. The fast glycolytic is very fast, but it has low resistance to fatigue. It has few mitochondria. It's going to work fast, and it's going to fatigue fast. All right, and that concludes our presentation on muscles in action. And tune in later for the nervous system.